Hello everyone. So in this lecture we're going to be talking about muscle. In this case we're talking specifically about skeletal muscle, which is voluntary muscle. Okay. There are many functions of skeletal muscle. Obviously body movement is a very important function. Maintenance of posture. So anytime you're trying to keep yourself erect, the reason why you don't slouch, normally speaking, you don't fall over while you're standing, is because your muscles actually fire and maintain that upright posture. A very minor function of skeletal muscle is protection and support, and we're talking more about protection and support in the abdominal region. If you think about it, your abdominal pelvic region is actually supported predominantly by muscle, your abdominal muscles predominantly speaking. Another function of skeletal muscle is the regulation of the elimination of materials, and when we talk about regulating elimination of materials, we're talking about sphincters. So a lot of in this case, if you want to think about your anus, actually has two sphincters made up of muscle. Now there's an involuntary sphincter and there's a voluntary sphincter as well. And then last but not least is heat production, and heat is produced when you start shivering. Okay, so shivering, the reason why you shiver when you're cold is it's just your skeletal muscle trying to create heat to maintain your temperature at homeostasis at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, there are, if you want to look at this, 5 characteristics of skeletal muscle tissue, right? And the first one is excitability. What does excitability mean? Excitability means the ability to move when there is, in this case, when a stimulus actually is applied. And we're talking about stimulus, we're talking about neurons firing. So your muscles don't fire by themselves. They have to be excited by the nervous system. Okay? The second thing is conductivity. Conductivity means to say that your muscles must be able to contract as a whole, right? So that muscle contraction must occur throughout the whole skeletal muscle tissue. It cannot just occur at one spot. It must occur throughout the whole muscle. So your biceps has to contract as a whole, all right? Contractility. Contractility means the ability to shorten. Okay, elasticity means to say, and elasticity, folks, has something to do with contractility and extensibility. Contractility is the ability to shorten. Extensibility is the ability to, in this case, be lengthened. And elasticity is the ability to go from one and the other, right? So if it must go back to its original shape after it contracts or after it extends. So that's where elasticity comes from. This is a skeletal muscle, and this is skeletal muscle tissue. If you look at it, the best analogy I have for you about skeletal muscle is actually multiple sausages wrapped inside other sausages. Okay, so if you look at this one, multiple sausages wrapped by a casing called the endomysium. Okay, and then this multiple sausages is further divided into another, in this case, casing called perimysium. And then this perimysium, you have multiple bigger sausages wrapped up in another casing, and then eventually the whole muscle is actually wrapped up by this thing called epimysium. All of these ischiums, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, is actually just connective tissue. In this case, it's actually called fascia, okay, if you want to think about it that way. And fascias, these fascias eventually come together at the terminal end of the muscle and become a tendon. And tendons, as a rule, are the point of attachments of muscle to bones. So muscle to bone is connected via tendon, bone to bone is connected via ligaments. Okay, so that's actually where that comes from. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So if we go back to the previous one, we're going to be talking about this muscle fibers here. There's actually 3 main types of muscle fibers. And if you can look at this one, you actually have this is actually a very poor photo, but we're gonna use this for now. You actually have, in this case, very red muscles, right? And then if you want to look at it, you actually have very dark, very pale, and something intermediate. Okay, and those 3 muscles, if you look at through this, is actually classified by 2 different ways. But we have slow excitative, fast excitative, and fast glycolytic. where does all of these terms come from? These terms, folks, these terms for muscle fiber types come from the dominant way in which those muscle fibers create ATP, right? If you remember, glycolysis is the first step of ATP production. It occurs outside the mitochondria in the cytoplasm, right? So fast glycolytic muscles generally in this case create ATP through just glycolysis. In this case, they still do just a very, very small bit of, in this case, oxidative phosphorylation or through the electron transport chain via the mitochondria, but to a lesser extent. Then we have slow oxidative fibers, and if you look at it, it's called SO. It's the darkest in color, okay? And slow oxidative fibers, generally in this case, create a higher proportion of ATP via the full metabolic pathway, meaning it goes through glycolysis, it goes through the Krebs cycle, it goes through the electron transport chain, okay? And then FO, the fast oxidative fiber, is actually a mix, okay? If you want to think of it, this is a very simplistic explanation, but this is the best I can do for now, just to generalize things. It's actually a mixture of both glycolysis, just glycolysis, and all the way through, in this case, the electron transport chain. Where does the red, the brown, and the white colors come from? So if you remember, the use of the mitochondria requires oxygen, okay? And in muscle, oxygen is actually stored, right, through in this case, a protein called myoglobin, okay? So in fibers that create ATP generally from oxidative phosphorylation through the mitochondria, you need to have high amounts of oxygen which is stored in those cells via myoglobin. Similar to hemoglobin, which is also red. And if you look at fast glycolytic muscles, they're very, very pale. And the reason why they're very, very pale, folks, is they actually have a very, very small amounts of mitochondria because, again, they prefer to create their ATP through cytoplasmic glycolysis. Okay? Now, there are consequences in this case of power based on their diameter. If you look at this closely, this is actually a very good image, but fast glycolytic muscles, folks, are actually, in this case, the widest in diameter. And because of that, they're the most powerful. So power of muscles is generally related to, in this case, the diameter of the muscle, okay? The bigger the diameter of the muscle, the bigger the diameter of the muscle fiber, the more powerful it is. The skinnier, the less powerful it is, okay? Here we go. This is actually a great explanation of which fiber is actually preferred. You see Usain Bolt on the right side. He probably has a higher proportion of fast glycolytic muscle fibers. And then you actually have, in this case, medium distance runners, and those probably have a higher proportion of fast oxidative. And then obviously you need the mitochondria in long distances as the marathon, and that's probably why you have more of in this case, a slow oxidative, okay? Glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, 50-50, right? This type of fibers are thicker, more powerful, okay? Thinner, less powerful, but less fatigued, more easily fatigued. Okay, because again, glycolysis creates a very, very small amount of ATP, whereas the electron transport chain creates much, much, much more ATP. So that's where the fatigue comes into play. All right, this is also in your PowerPoint slides. Okay, so please read through this. So muscle, there's also two types of contractions in this case. You actually have muscle, you have to actually have isotonic or isometric contraction. If you, let's say you are carrying, in this case, groceries and your arms are fully extended, the reason why you can move that load around is through this process called isometric contraction, okay? All right, so the reason why it's called isometric contraction is because even though your muscle is contracting, okay, the reason why it's called iso is because it remains the same length. Okay, it doesn't shorten at all in this case, right? Whereas in isotonic contraction, right, the actual muscle, the whole muscle in this case actually contracts, which means it actually in this case becomes shorter, okay, in terms of length. So that's the difference between isometric and isotonic contraction. Very important. What is agonist versus antagonist? So this is an example in your upper arm. This is, you have the biceps and your triceps. What you have to think about is when your biceps, when your biceps fire, if you guys look at this biceps, this is when your biceps fire, this shortens, and at the same time your triceps actually lengthens, right? What happens is if both of this shortens at the same time, no flexion occurs, no movement occurs, right? So the muscle that contracts is called the prime mover, and the muscle that relaxes during a movement is called the antagonist, okay? In this case, right? Now, there is a reason why it's called prime mover, and we also have this, in this case, a term called agonist, is because there are sometimes other muscles that actually help the prime mover. So you have the prime mover, the agonist, which are small muscles that help the movement of the prime mover, and then you actually have the big muscle in this case that relaxes in response to that movement, which is called the antagonist. Now, if you extend your elbow, the roles get reversed. The bicep now becomes the antagonist, and now the triceps becomes the prime mover. All right, and we'll look at this thing, for instance. Now, where does agonist, antagonist, prime mover comes from? Well, folks, let's look at this one, right? We actually have origins and insertions of muscles. And most of the time, the origins of the muscle, and this is a generalization again, okay, do not cross a joint. If you guys can see this is the joint. The origin does not cross a joint, whereas the insertion, if you look at the insertion actually crosses the joint. So what happens, folks, when this muscle contracts? Where this muscle contracts, it pulls at the origin and it pulls at the insertion. Since it crosses this joint, it pulls. It pulls at this area, and that is why flexion occurs. All right? Most of the time, folks, you can actually tell the actual action of a muscle based on their position, right? If you look at your arm and you extend your arm, correct? The biceps, if you want to think about it, is actually, if you feel it, right, is actually on the inside part of your joint, correct? So, or in this case, the joint, in this case, the movement of the joint. On the leg, it's the opposite way. And that's actually one of the reasons why, if you think about it, your thigh muscles, the upper thighs muscles on the anterior compartment, called the quadriceps muscle, if it extends, it's actually extensors, and in this case, the thigh muscles on the posterior compartment, called the hamstring muscles, are actually flexors, right? In your arm, it's the opposite. So your flexors in this case, okay, are on the, in this case, are on the anterior compartment, and then your extensors are in your posterior compartment, okay? So again, just know that muscles have origins and insertions, that origins normally do not cross a joint, and insertions normally do cross a joint. This is generalizations again, there are exceptions to the rule, okay? And you can also do variations in this one, okay? So if your origin barely crosses a joint, but then on the insertion really crosses a joint, then the distance in which it actually spans a joint is called the insertion in this case again.